Coming to you from Denver, Colorado, I am Patrick Sullivan, a designer on Eternal, and it is my pleasure to be joined by the recent winner of the Sills Ambition 5K Draft Open, Levi ltsTenz, better known as ltsTenz, but perhaps not actually should be known as ltsTenz. How are you doing?
I'm all right. It's a pretty good night so far.
So usually the first question I ask here is, your story with Eternal and how you started playing competitively and all that, but I want to back up for a minute. It is a source of much speculation in the community what your username actually is. Is that an I or an L? What is the origin of it? So I wanted, before we dove into your story as an Eternal player, to settle once and for all on the record, what is your screen name?
It is, in fact, a lowercase l.
How do you go about pronouncing it?
I don't personally pronounce it. Like, that is not my job, really. Other people come to me and, some of them get it right, some of them don't. A lot of people don't actually realize that it is an L until they're like trying to at me in Twitch chat and it won't autocomplete. So in that regard, there's probably people that have known me for years that haven't realized this yet, but it just, I don't always, like, somebody brings it up in chat, like, oh, wait, your name starts with an L. And I'm like, oh, and then somebody else is like, oh, I didn't know that. I've known you for a long time now. And it never clicked. So
in future tournaments, when I'm covering you, because during the Open, I'm sure you saw the coverage. Andrew and I were saying ltsTenz over and over again.
yeah,
Are
totally
you okay
fine
with me perpetuating this error? Okay, great. So we'll go with ltsTenz.
No, I actually made the ltsTenz Twitch account as well after that, but since I'd like friended everybody on this one and had like established all of that, I ended up not really using it. So
well, there's an expression that I really like in game design, which is the first time it's a mistake, after that it's precedent. So I'm going to lean into the precedent here and we'll go with ltsTenz. So now let's get to the actual first question that I typically ask people, which is, tell me a little bit about your story, discovering Eternal and sort of leveling up through the ranks of, aspiring to competitive play and eventually playing in Opens and qualifying for the World Championships and all that.
well, so I had just a very long history with other card games going into that. And I was living with a guy named Justin Cohen, who you probably know, and he initially told me about the game. And at the time I was playing some other digital games and I was kind of being disenchanted with them, and I'd like log in and watch other people play, but I wasn't really feeling playing myself that much. So I was kind of like looking for other games. And so that like put Eternal on my radar, but I didn't start playing it immediately. And then a friend that I played another game with actually was just like, she knew I played a lot of limited in that game. And then she also knew that I had previously played Magic. And she was like, you want to just do an Eternal draft with me? And I was like, okay, but I don't know what any of these cards are. I mean, I can look at cards and maybe have an idea if they're good or not, but it's kind of in a vacuum. I don't have any context as far as like what other cards exist in the game. But we did a draft and that went 7, and that was my first experience. At which point, we both enjoyed it because winning is fun, and it was, there's a novel to the experience as well. And we ended up being like, okay, let's do this again. So we were going to do it again, but something came up for her and we canceled. And I still wanted to play, so I ended up making an account. And this happened to coincide with a time in my life where my parents were going out of town for a month for one of my brother's weddings out of country. And they had a cat that they needed me to house sit for. So I had a month of free time, basically, watching a house and a cat, which wasn't terribly high maintenance. So that resulted in me playing a lot of Eternal.
So Justin Cohen, for the viewer at home who might not be familiar, is a game designer over here at Direwolf Digital. He has worked on Eternal in the past and is currently doing just excellent work over on the board game side. So someone very near and dear to to the Direwolf Digital family and pretty surreptitious for you to have him as a roommate because I know that he is tuned on to all sorts of games.
Well, it was kind of funny because when I think it was around I first started playing, it was literally the day before Fall of Argenport. So it was nice in the sense that I was starting at a time where other people would also not be super familiar with like the cards that were being released. So it kind of evened things out for me with my inexperience. And at that time, he was like, hey, we should, try and play this competitively. They're going to have competitive events. And that was like great. But then he got hired and he couldn't participate in them anymore. And so I was kind of like looking to do that, but then I kind of lost interest when I didn't really have that support group, kind of thing anymore.
So you said around the Fall of Argenport is when you started playing.
Yes.
So did you? So I guess you kind of answered the question here of, Justin turned you on to the game and talked about playing competitively and that there were going to be tournaments with cash prizes. Was that always sort of the like goal in mind, I guess, was to get to that stage, or were you just sort of playing it for kicks for a while and then eventually decided to take a stab at some of the tournaments?
Uh, it was very much the second part. I just went in looking to have something to do. Like I've played a number of free-to-play card games, and I have a tendency to like grind full collections just from limited and most of them. And I was really enjoying the draft format at the time, and I'm actually a big Gauntlet player too, so I was enjoying that as well. And I just enjoy like getting new stuff in games. Uh, so I kind of been doing that, but then that gave me the foundation to be able to play competitively if I wanted to. And
So were you sort of going full bore into draft kind of from the start, or were you eventually kind of taking the stuff that you had, the cards you'd accumulated and whatever else, and started pivoting towards constructed at all?
uh, very heavy on the draft. It was basically as soon as I get 5,000 gold, I'd be in another draft, which I personally like now with, some experience and like looking back in retrospect, I probably wouldn't necessarily recommend that to new players. I would say you're better off actually like building up kind of a nest egg of gold first, because I think you get more out of draft as a learning experience if you're able to do them kind of one after another. And if you're just kind of like doing something else, and then doing another one later, like I think it's harder for your mind to like conglomerate those things and like the lessons you might learn about the format together. And I think it's easier if you're kind of doing more of a marathon approach to it.
Yeah, I mean that was also what you just spoke to. Definitely informed some of the changes to the draft rewards and the economy of like we know that there once people are drafting a lot, it's like they want to be doing that, and the experience becomes kind of more satisfying in the way that you're describing of like that level of immersion, like eventually picking up the nuances and having some freedom to try different archetypes, or you open up a rare, you don't know how good it is, like just pick it and see how it goes. And that experience is just a lot more engaging once people are in the position to sort of just keep chaining it together, as you mentioned.
Yeah. And I do think that the reward changes were a significant factor in me drafting Cold Hunt as much as I did.
So that leads me into sort of your testing for the event. Were you working with a group of people, or were you sort of just on your own drafting a bunch?
So yeah, I was on my own. Basically what happened was I saw the preview event for Cold Hunt, and during the spoiler season, I saw like 3 times as many cards as I'm usually excited about. So I was going in excited about the set. And then the draft rewards were also announced, like the changes to the prize structure that made drafting just seem much more appealing. So I started there, and then the set came out, and I loved Inscribe and Contract as mechanics. I think that they're very, very good limited mechanics. Inscribe, because being able to play your cards allows fewer non-games, and I like that Contract allows a player to a lot of times in games there will be situations that arise where you need to do something immediately, and previously before Contract it was a binary, you either could or you couldn't. And now you have more of the option to react immediately and kind of pay for it later. And often that's the difference between being able to do something or just not at all. So I think in that regard, it makes limited a much better format. I really like the format, so I drafted it very intensely for 4 months. When the format was changed and the packs were reordered and the curated things, like at that point, it had been 4 months or so, people were looking for a new format. I didn't really love the new format, so I basically stopped playing for like 6 months, or not 6 months, 6 weeks. And then the day before the event started, the day one event, I drafted like most of the day before that. And that was basically my preparation.
So what did you not like about the change? Because there's basically two things that are going on there. One is the pack order is different. And then secondly, there's plus and minus cards, Nightfall made a return. What were the things about the change that you found unappealing or just weren't for you or whatever the case may be?
So for me, the thing is that compared to the curated packs, the Cold Hunt packs are just significantly more powerful, which means that when you have that as your first pack, you're looking at your more powerful cards first. So it's easier to have a sense of where your deck is going. Whereas when you flip it around and you do the curated packs, it's very easy to just be like getting to the next pack, seeing all these good cards that aren't in the colors and feeling like your first pack just didn't really do anything for you. And then in addition to that, it wasn't necessarily bad. It was more a sense that the format hadn't changed like a lot. So in that sense, it kind of felt like I was still doing what I was doing for the last 4 months. And I'd been doing that a lot. So there was probably a bit of a burnout factor in that regard as well.
So my own like personal experience playing the format was I felt like once the draft set aside the contents actually being different and just speaking to the order of the packs, that I found myself drafting two factions a lot more often after the change went, because when you're starting off with Cold Hunt, you have you could just be kind of grabbing inscribed cards and remain super flexible. And as you mentioned, the average common is probably stronger than in the curated pack. And so you got to have this like architecture of fixing and like low opportunity cost inscribed cards, and then you could kind of fill out from there. When you started with the curated pack, you were a lot more kind of, I'm settling into two factions early because I don't have the same saturation of fixing and inscribe to start off the draft. I'm curious if you had a similar experience, or you sort of said that the format didn't feel that different to you. Were you still kind of just doing the same strategies?
So in the initial format of the Cold Hunt, curated Cold Hunt, I know that during your interview with the Overmaster, he had said that he thought, that the 4-faction Invoke deck was basically where you wanted to be. And I was personally never of that opinion. So I usually ended up going in drafting 2 colors and wanting to splash powerful cards of a third, if I could, off of inscribes or whatever. So as a result, that's kind of like, yes, 4-faction Invoke was a perfectly fine deck. It wasn't one I gravitated towards, and as a result, my 2 main colors, slight splash of a third approach to the format didn't really change that much in the end when the next format came out.
Well, this has given me a sigh of relief here, because my approach to drafting both the previous format and this one was much more, the one that you won was much more in the space that you're describing. And I was watching some of these drafts. Now I could be a little honest about it. I'm not on the air. I was watching some of these drafts and I'm like, I feel like I'm losing my mind here. Like people are just doing this stuff for the sake of doing it. And then anytime someone just had like a 2-faction deck with units that could attack, there was just like the other side was just all their power was depleted. They couldn't play their stuff. And by the time they could play their stuff, it wasn't even particularly good. But I saw it so much that I was like, this is, I guess this has got to be the thing. Like, I'm not arrogant enough to assume that I'm watching like the 60 or 70 best drafters, they're all doing the same thing. I guess it's just me with my biases, right? So this interview is already putting me at ease hearing you talk about the format kind of more in terms of the way that I approached it.
Yeah, like the 4 or 5 faction invoke decks were powerful, but they weren't particularly fast, and you still needed to be able to defend yourself, or you just die to people, like not even necessarily particularly fast decks, just people that were like playing a bunch of Calderon captains over and over with some like 2 or 3 drops. So I think in that sense, like, yeah, those decks were always a lot better in the later games, and you didn't always get to the later games. So
I had this feeling watching the World Championships and some of our other draft stuff of being like, I feel like if these people could just play 45 rune swords, they would play 45 rune swords. And that's just like that's just not my style. Like I gravitate more towards just be streamlined, efficient, make sure you can play your cards. Just so many games come down to one player just not being able to play stuff. Like, just don't let that be you. But then watching our best players just do basically the opposite of that for 4 months, I was sort of like, is it them or is it me? And the answer could be it's somewhere in the middle, right? Like the 4 faction
yeah,
stuff can be fine some amount of time, but I gotta tell you, this is relaxing me
well,
talking
that's
about it
good.
this way.
I'm glad
So
that I could do this for you.
so has it settled into you on top of everything else that you are, barring something very unforeseen, the last draft open champion that used a curated pack as part of the tournament?
No, I had not even considered that until you just mentioned that right now.
How much of your, playing in this tournament was knowing the weighting and knowing the exact distribution and knowing all the rares and legendaries in the curated pack, like that sort of granular information that I'm sure the average drafter is not looking at? Was that a big part of your preparation, or were you just sort of drafting a bunch and feeling out sort of what the format felt like?
Well, I was just loving the format in general, so that just made me want to keep playing it. And there's just things you pick up on if you do something long enough. Like, hey, you probably want to be playing a bunch of inscribed cards and 15 power in this format. you know and I don't think that was a particularly difficult one to pick up on, and I think most people found that. But like weighting wise, like things like Calderian Captain and Starkist Wings, like you get an impression for the kinds of cards that are really good at common, because that's what you're going to be seeing the most of when you're drafting. So
Have you gotten an opportunity to check out the new draft format, or are you still sort of just holding pattern on some of the stuff after your win?
I have I went to bed at rank 1 last night, so I don't think I am anymore, though. I believe I was passed while I was sleeping. So
So I'm sort of interested in going into your story a little bit more here, because most of the people that I've talked to who have won these opens, like they're kind of on, like in a physical sense, they're sort of on an island, and they have a team that's composed of like just people that they've met in chat rooms or they've worked well with or whatever the case may be. Your introduction to Eternal sounds a lot more person to person. You had people like in your presence who are encouraging you to play. And you've mentioned just sort of like doing these deep dives of draft and playing alongside other people who are sort of teaching you. Do you sort of feel like I don't know what you want to call it, a community sense, a cultural sense, that you have like a different story than a lot of the top grinders? Or have you met other people who have more of I guess, a real life connection to the people and experiences they have playing the game?
well, I think like mostly for me, the community part is basically all through Twitch. So that's how I know most of the people, and like I talk with them inside the game and outside the game as well, but that's basically where most of my connection to the people involved with the game come from.
And are you sort of just like in the Twitch rooms, just sort of like just chatting or whatever, or is there sort of like a curated group of people who, you're bouncing ideas off of, or to the extent you're trying to test with?
I don't really do much in the well, okay, so the testing I do is mostly for Gauntlet, actually.
Oh,
Okay, so when I initially started playing, I think I played up until maybe Defiance or so, and I was just doing the normal experience of basically doing everything in the game, sealed, forged, uh, draft a lot, playing constructed. There was a period where I was trying to finish top 10 in both constructed and draft for like 3 months in a row, and I kind of got burned out after that. At which point I actually started grinding Gauntlet so I could have more gold for draft. And I actually just like really started enjoying Gauntlet. So I basically played that by itself for the next 2.5 years. Um, so and it was kind of funny because like as it was happening, like I've got all this gold and I'm like, if I ever see a draft format I really like, I'm ready to go. I can just play it as much as I want. And that hadn't really happened for a while. And then with the cold hunt, I got excited because of all the spoilers. And then there was also the rewards change. And that's really what got me to jump back in. And then I just had all these extra resources that I was able to play as much as I wanted to.
That's so cool. I gotta say, like, it does another thing that really heartens me about doing these interviews. It's like you're talking to these players who are like competitive. They're very good at the game. They're among the best, and you just assume that it's all the same story. Like, yeah, I just was like, I played a bunch of other games, and then I started grinding this one, and I was good at it. And I remember I did an interview with someone about 6 months ago where they were like, "Oh yeah, I started playing when the game came out on Switch." Because like I play a lot of games on Switch, and a few months later I qualified for the first tournament, and it's like, oh yeah, all this little stuff like you're talking about with Gauntlet and Forge, a thing to do while maybe you're sort of in a holding pattern with the game more broadly, or the different platforms to go on. Like if the people who are really really good and in that sort of competitive archetype are taking advantage of that stuff, then it feels like there's got to be a ton of players for whom they have like a similar story of getting involved. So that's really cool. So you were just like banging Forge and Gauntlet like all day, or like a lot for a couple of years, and just like waiting to get ready for whatever the format was that drew you in.
Well, so I wasn't like really going in with that mindset, but it was just kind of something in the back of my mind where it's like, I guess it's nice if that ever happens. But it was kind of just like I enjoyed playing Gauntlet. I enjoyed tuning decks specifically for that because, it takes a different set of skills. And I actually had like a Discord group. You can call them Team Gauntlet if you would like. So I guess that's my team. Um, but like we just bounce ideas off of each other, and because you get to use cards in a different way than you would necessarily against people because of the AI play patterns. And the thing about Gauntlet and Forge is that there's no turn timer, so you can do it while you're just doing other things. So it wasn't really just like me focusing on the game and just playing Gauntlet for hours on end. It was like me watching stuff when I had some free time, and also just playing games at the same time without really having to worry too much about paying attention to the other side of it.
So I kind of want to pivot over towards the tournament itself. Going in, like obviously you had drafted a ton. Did you have a sense of like, I know I've done my work. I know I've drafted this. There's probably not that many people who've drafted more than me. I feel really confident about being able to make it to Sunday and maybe making a run, or was it just more like a thing to do? You had the goals, you had the time.
It was very much a thing to do. I was on 3 hours of sleep that night, and I woke up and I was tired. And the previous draft open that had happened, I believe there might have been another one for the Cold Hunt format previously.
Yeah.
I missed that one because I basically slept through it. So I was like, man, I don't feel like I can use that excuse twice. So I'm just gonna hop in there and see how it goes.
How tight was your Friday and Saturday run?
So my day one run, it was an interesting deck because it was just solidly three colors, like completely evenly divided. My card pool was pretty hot, like the quality was good. I had double Delif, which I'm not the biggest fan of, but it's still a pretty powerful card, and double foraging Trito. So I probably did some losing to unseen commandos, or not unseen commando, unseen marksman. But
Mhm.
I felt like it was like I had some inscribes, so my power wasn't like absolutely terrible. Uh, it wasn't like a particularly exciting run to like qualification because it was just like win a few games, lose a game, win a few games, lose a game, win a few games. That's it.
How was the quality of competition versus like a random, just any random middle of the week draft?
Uh, I feel like it was kind of similar, honestly. Like you see
Mhm.
some big name players and you see some people that you've never seen before. So it wasn't like too bad. I think I ended up going 11-3.
Did you have a buy on the opening round, or were you playing in?
I did have a buy from like I hadn't actually hit Masters that month, but I think I'd actually finished rank 1 the month before that. So I had my medallion from that.
So how are you feeling on Sunday? Like obviously at this point it's going to be tougher competition, and there's like an opportunity to qualify for Worlds, and it's interesting because it doesn't sound like, obviously you had a lot of experience and sort of preparation coming in, but it doesn't really sound like you're putting a ton of pressure on yourself. Um,
Absolutely none.
so is there a
So
point? Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
so I I had gotten 3 hours of sleep on like the night before day 1. And I was like, okay, I'm really tired. I'll be able to go to bed at a great time tonight, and I'll be able to wake up, all rested and refreshed. I'll make some coffee, get some food. And I ended up only being able to sleep another 3 hours the night before day 2. So, and the thing about sleep deprivation is sometimes it affects your math. So when I read that the tournament was at 11 a.m. on your time, I'm an hour ahead of you, but in my brain, I messed that up. So I thought I needed to be ready at 10 a.m. my time instead of noon. So I ended up getting up a few hours before the actual tournament that I needed to. But at that point, it was kind of too late for me to actually get more sleep. So
So I'm taking it that maybe if one were to ask you in that moment, you maybe did not have the highest expectations for yourself coming into
I
Sunday.
I did not. No, I was like, yeah, it's kind of funny because like it's not like I really needed, to win any packs or anything. So in a sense, it was kind of like, yeah, I guess this would be great if, I could win some money. But if not, if I lose early, at least I can go take a nap or something instead.
So how much do you recall about sort of like the drafts you did on Sunday, or key moments, or is it all kind of a blur at this point?
Uh, I feel like I probably still retain quite a bit of that. Uh, so the draft on Sunday, I opened my curated pack and I'm just like looking at it and I'm like so ready for this event. And my pack is not good. And so at this point, it's kind of damage control mode. And I'm like, what card here is the one that I am most likely to play just in my final deck? And I ended up settling on a Xenon banner just because none of the other cards were really doing it for me.
Oh, me and
I
you
can
are
tell you have
singing off
something to
the
say here.
same sheet of music. I love that pick. I mean, I don't know what else is in the pack, but I mean, it's like if it's a coin flip whether or not you're going to play any of these cards. Like it's probably one of the best cards in your deck if your deck is bad, and it's probably one of the best cards in your deck if your deck is good.
Yeah, well, so it was the kind of thing where you know, I look at it that way. Like, if you don't know what you're doing, like fixing is usually a safe way to go, especially in a format where you could conceivably be playing more than 3 colors. And actually, at the end of the draft, I ended up with 3 shadow duels that I didn't play because I never saw any shadow cards that I even wanted to splash, but I gave myself that option.
Yeah, me and you just singing off the same sheet of music with this. This is so by number of first pick banners, I'm going to guess is near the top or perhaps at the top of the community at large.
I mean, I would have
So
been happy taking, something more impactful potentially than a banner, but you know, it wasn't there, and you got to work with what you see.
Right. I don't mind a torch first either, you know what I mean? But I also don't mind a banner first. A lot of people mind a first pick banner. I am not one of those people. So when you got to the end of your draft, you said, you had you had some shadow sigils, but nothing really ever materialized there. How were you feeling about the draft after you were done with your first one?
Okay, so actually, I timed myself. The draft portion itself took me 6 minutes, and then building my deck took me 8. So I still had roughly 45 minutes left before the round was supposed to start. I built the deck, and it was a Praxis deck splashing some powerful green cards. And at that point, I was like, well, I've got 45 minutes to just think about my decisions for the time being. And I ended up actually like building my deck a little differently than I think I necessarily would if I was just playing on ladder. Uh, one of the reasons was because of the open like pools. Like I actually had a find the moment and a daring maneuver in my pool that I'd picked that I wasn't really keen to play. The find the moment more so because it was splash, and I just kind of man daring maneuver as a card. But having these extra 2 tricks in your pool that your opponent doesn't know if you're actually putting in your deck, like combined with my other tricks, I think it made my deck a lot scarier to engage in combat with. And I think that actually did end up paying me dividends over the
Did
course of
you
the.
did you get an opportunity to watch the coverage of your event?
I saw some of it, yes.
Okay, so I'm glad you mentioned this too, because I was like, oh, open deck lists are obviously that's an entirely different animal. How does that affect your valuations and whatever? And another card that, this is just me, I'm gonna be on my soapbox a minute here of just one is not a card that I'm super keen on to begin with, but two, in open deck list world is just like so much worse was Vermin's Feast. And watching our players like take it really highly and then like clutch it instead of inscribing it, and then it never really materializing was very interesting to me. And it's good to see, or cool to hear you call out sort of like, oh well, what do I do with these tricks? Maybe they're not, splashing find the moment's not ideal, and daring maneuvers is a little mopey, but do they have a different value in the sort of setup where they actually get to see my pool?
Well, the having that information was also especially beneficial to me, possibly more so than some of the other competitors, because at this point I was quite tired and I didn't really have the mental bandwidth to evaluate like all the pauses that could possibly exist, within the format. So knowing that it could only be like a few cards from my opponent's, the information that was sent to me ahead of time, like, and only having to play around those. Like I remember against the collector, like, 1 cost pause is like, oh, that's an indifference. And it was like, yep, kind of got to play around that for the rest of the game.
Well, that's what really the thing that struck me the most about watching you play. I mean, there's always going to be plays where there's, it's a judgment call, there's room for disagreement, whatever. But you were like playing around everything perfectly. Like that was the one thing that really jumped out at me, of just one being able to extract, like you said, from people's like response windows and stuff like that. But just in general, like all right, well, it's A, B, or C. What's the best way to play around everything here? I think of all the players that I watched, that you did the best job of just sort of executing on that. And it's really cool to hear you talk about like your level of experience and then all these open deck lists. And then if you asked me after the event, where did your edge materialize? It was like just playing around everything better than everyone else from what I saw. Were you feeling like, in spite of your sleep deprivation, that you were just kind of, at least you could pull something out from your experience there and having the deck lists?
Well, in some regards, I actually feel like it was somewhat beneficial to me too, because I just didn't really have the energy to be nervous about it. Like, and I didn't really go in thinking like, yeah, this is my time to shine. I'm going to Worlds today, baby. Like, I didn't go in with that kind of mindset. So it was like, if I win, that's great. But like, if I lose, like I was okay with that too. So I didn't really feel like I was so personally invested in what was happening that I was like worrying about it. And I think that maybe nerves got to some of my opponents, because of the 7 matches I played that day, like I was able to see things afterwards, and I was like, I should have lost 4 of those.
Yep.
Because a lot of
Yep.
my, like, I think all but 1 or 2 of my matches ended up going to 3 games.
Was there a point, you're spinning this yarn about sleep deprivation and just trying to get through the thing and low expectations. Was there a point like at like top 8, top 4 finals, like whatever the case may be, where you're like, oh, okay, like this is like within striking distance, like I could actually do this whole thing.
Yeah, it was probably around top 16 or so. Like I felt pretty good after my first round. That was one I probably should have lost, but it was able to clutch it very narrowly. And, I kind of just kept winning after that. And a lot of the games were still pretty close. Like I liked the way my deck was, but I didn't think it was like particularly dominant by any means. It certainly had the ability to punish people that, had power issues. And I ended up playing 16 power in my deck because I didn't have a lot of inscribe. And that was one of the decisions that I ended up making like 30 minutes after I'd initially built my deck, just after ruminating on it for a while. I had an Illuminator that was double time, and I didn't really have a lot of like spell support for it. And I didn't really think I would be casting it on turn 3 super reliably. And in the end, I ended up playing 16 power. And I feel like that actually helped me quite a bit in the end. Because it was, I believe it was, I swapped that out for another power of my splash. And my splash was really powerful.
I mean, a lot of the matches I lost were just someone not being able to play their stuff. No,
Yeah,
sorry,
I
not
heard that
just
was
being
kind
able
of
to
a
play their
recurring
stuff.
theme on the coverage.
So there was a lot of matches that they can't play their stuff, and then there was another tranche of matches that was this person's not in the zip code of being able to play their stuff. Even if they drew the right power for the next 2 turns, they can't play their stuff. Saw a lot of it.
Yeah. Well, so Invoke, I'm not a huge fan of the mechanic, but in a general sense, Invoke does make it less painful in a format to have to go to 6, but I still hate going to 6. So I feel like that's something that you're kind of forced to do a lot more often with those 4-color and 5-color decks. Oh, I think we have a cat approaching.
Ooh, hello. Do you mind if I ask your cat's name?
This is Lux. He is
Lux.
quite old.
Hello. Hey, bud. Oh, you can't hear me. You got a headset in. I just love the impromptu cameos from small children and pets and roommates during these things.
Well, I was told that I shouldn't attempt to discourage it because apparently
No,
this is, what people live for. So
the cat cameo is like that's a 10% bump at least on the views, like in my experience. So yeah, I would sign up for more Lux cameos, and I'm sure our viewers would as well. So, how are you feeling about the World Championships? From the perspective of sort of testing and preparing the rest of the year of organized play, like, are you going to be going full bore, or do you sort of feel like, well, the sort of like casual and somewhat detached approach was effective for me here, and maybe just try to run that back?
well, I definitely anticipate that I will put in more effort than I had initially done. I feel like, there's probably a decent amount of, EV on that time being spent at this point, but that's still ways off in the future, and there's going to be another set before then, and I haven't played constructed against humans in like 3 years at this point. So and I mean, one of the formats will be expedition, and obviously the draft format's going to change quite a bit by then with the new set. So I feel like I'm going to have to learn a format that doesn't currently exist, so I'll probably worry about that when it does.
Cool. So something that I like to do when I am doing these interviews is open up the floor for any questions that you may have. You know, people don't get a whole lot of one-on-one time with one of the designers. And obviously I have right of refusal to reject or dishonestly edit any question and answer in the post. That's where my power comes in. But you know, if you've got any questions that you have for me or for us, I'm all ears.
Well, I mean, honestly, yeah, you might want to exercise that right of refusal here.
Okay.
Just throwing that out there. I just don't really get Unleash and Taunt as mechanics because I feel like they lead to more non-games or games where players kind of play for a while and then one person has an Unleash card and it feels like a lot of what you did leading up to that didn't really matter. Games aren't necessarily a zero-sum fun kind of thing. And I think losing to that is frustrating in a way that probably sticks with players longer. I'm kind of curious, like, I'd like to hear more about your thoughts on these mechanics.
So what I thought was going to be interesting about Unleash, and I do believe it's like from the view stance that I'm describing it from, it is kind of successful or pretty successful, is coming off of Cold Hunt where you have Inscribe and Contract. Those are two mechanics that sort of allow you to have more power and allow you to space off the ways that you pay costs. In terms of just like the baseline, like, do these mechanics interact in ways that are satisfying and interesting and give people like a lot of options for how they use their power and how they want to time things? I think they do a really, like, from that lens, Unleash alongside the Cold Hunt stuff is really successful. I would say it's not even just Unleash, it's sort of all the stuff of you have all these options. You're really protected from the downside risk of your card not working the right way. There is a risk of, well, all the cards my opponents are playing against me are really, really strong because they have a bunch of options and they get to select the option that's the most powerful. There is something to that experience for sure. And I think that's what you're speaking to me is a lot more about that than necessarily like, is Unleash itself the specifically like arduous or violating mechanic through that lens. And then with Taunt, which you also mentioned, that's obviously something that we had to be really careful with because
Yes.
the downside risk of the play pattern is my unit died and the next unit in my hand also will just die. We were pretty judicious, at least we tried to be, about Taunt being a lot more, here's a one-shot spell that gives it, or a summon effect, the unit has it for a turn where you can gift it over for a turn, and pretty sparing on the, here's a 4/4 with Taunt. Like, we just don't have
would
that.
not have been good.
Right, we just don't have a whole lot of that going on. Like, we have the Dragonet rare, we have the uncommon Rakano unit that's like not even particularly good at draft in my mind. And I do think that what I've liked about Taunt playing with it myself is, one, there is a the spots where it is you're sort of getting locked out. Typically the game is over pretty quickly when that spot materializes. The tactical stuff is actually pretty rewarding and stimulating. There's also this interesting flow to it, which is there are two really good ways of playing around Taunt. One is hold everything back, and the other is attack with everything. And those two paths play around Taunt in different ways. So yeah, again, I guess with both of those mechanics, I would say they're not without some downside risk. Like, you know,
Well, in that scenario
Sorry, go
that
ahead.
you were describing, the problem that I find is that, yes, you can attack with all of your units, but if you want to play another unit and keep developing, like, that then exposes that one unit that you have. And so in that sense, I think it more heavily favors you leaving everything behind, which, I don't know, play pattern wise, I don't feel like players necessarily enjoy just like walling up and leaving their stuff behind when it could potentially, you know, have an otherwise meaningful attack.
Well, and I mean, what you're describing too is like a risk with Unleash too, like a bunch of 1/2, if you make a bunch of 1/2 flying units or 1/1 flying units, that in some ways can facilitate attacking, but in some ways can facilitate blocking. And you know, we wanted to be really mindful of the game not feeling like it bogged down a ton for the reasons that you're saying. Like holding back with everything is a way to play around taunt. Playing a bunch of unleash units is powerful for blocking abstractly. Like there's certain designs are going to pivot one way or the other, but like at a baseline, yeah, it's better for the blocking player. And so there was a burden on us to just get in the weeds and make sure that those play patterns weren't materializing very often, or at least if they were, it felt like the player made a decision to go down that road and not like there was only one path for them to engage with. Certainly some of the games do go the way that you're describing. But as long as it's not deterministically that way, if the format feels materially different from other formats, if we print a new set and all these cards have a different context, that to me is sort of the test of time, and not like if you ask me just as a designer, which mechanic is safe, what set of mechanics is safer? Inscribe and contract or unleash and taunt? It'd be like, obviously, I know which one is safer. I know which one is like way less downside risk. But I do think that over time, there's a lot of value to things feeling different, and you can only make the thing feel different if it's actually different.
That is fair.
That isn't licensed to just do whatever and just say, oh, it's different this time. Like, obviously not. But I am willing to absorb some downside risk on some of the play patterns or some of the experiences if it's like from set to set you're like, oh, it feels really different. When we reprint a card in this set versus that set, the context really matters. When we look at our numbers, like our players play this game for years and years and years. Like once someone's in the door, they're in the door. And to me, the biggest thing to fight off is boredom. It's not necessarily the are all these mechanics optimized through the lens of like safety, you know?
That's fair. I'm not like coming here with the intent of like raging at you. I'm like genuinely interested in like understanding what you are thinking about these things.
You know, I've been doing this work for a really long time. The most like, what are the mistakes that I like regret the most, or what are the things I could walk back? It almost directly correlates with like certainty, like when I was sure this was going to go a certain way. And so I try to have, especially with a game like Eternal, where we have live balance as an approach, I put a big value on let's experiment, let's not be too sure, let's like leverage the knobs that we have if we make a mistake or we decide we want something to be a little bit more this way or that way, and just like learn over time. We've got this vast sandbox that we can play with. And again, it's not licensed to do whatever. Like I don't want things to be destabilized for the sake of it, but like let's actually feel what this stuff actually is like when we put it out in the real world. And if it goes the wrong way, we have knobs. And if it goes the right way, wow, am I glad we experimented. We really learned something from that.
Oh, that makes sense.
So last little bit of business. Team Gauntlet, Twitch, anything you want to shout out, any place where people can find you, now's a good time to boost yourself a little bit.
Yeah, Team Gauntlet, great. Love the people there. Not a lot of them, but you know, Orlin and Aitor Nordos, they're two of my friends from there, and they're probably a significant reason that I still enjoy like coming up with things like to do in the game, because otherwise I'd maybe just kind of be in a vacuum. I mean, there'd still be the Twitch side, but you know, coming up with cool decks that do cool things, and some of them are not even necessarily things that I particularly enjoy doing, but I know that other people will think are cool and enjoy. Like it kind of like gives me an additional reason to continue playing. So I appreciate them.
Very cool. Well, again, thank you so much for your time. Congratulations on your qualification for the World Championships. It was great talking to you. I'm glad that there's a fellow traveler when it comes to this draft format, because I feel like I was kind of I was starting to question myself a little bit watching some of these tournaments, and excited to get an opportunity to cover you later this year at the World Championships.
I'm looking forward to it.